Good evening, everyone. Right. So cities are meant for all, yet cities in India are often planned and built considering the needs of only a fraction of their residents, resulting in the creation of urban spaces which are inaccessible, exclusionary, and hostile to women, children, persons with disabilities, elderly, the socially and economically marginalized. With rapid growth and urbanization, the percentage of persons with disabilities living in urban areas is predicted to only increase. Within this population, factors such as gender, age, class, and caste, among others, intersect with disability, further impacting the nature of exclusion faced by such persons. Disability is an evolving concept. It is no longer understood as purely a medical condition or impairment which requires prevention and rehabilitation, but that disability arises due to the interaction of this impairment with barriers which prevents the person from fully and effectively enjoying and participating in society at par and equally with others. Even in the context of access to cities, a person is rendered disabled not just due to her impairment per se, but due to the interaction of this impairment with the barriers in the built environment, which prevent her from availing all opportunities which a city has to offer. Accessibility to urban spaces, in other words, effectively becomes a precondition for a person to enjoy their rights, such as education, employment, health facilities, outdoor and entertainment spaces, among others. It therefore becomes absolutely essential to turn a critical lens at the way society itself is organized and adopt a disability perspective in every dimension of urban planning. Beyond Reasonable Accommodation is a white paper that questions the way Indian cities are currently designed, planned, and built. It critically analyzes the applicable legislative framework that govern urban spaces and highlights the ways in which they remain inaccessible to persons with disabilities. The white paper classifies urban spaces into three components, which is built and physical environment, mobility and transportation, and information and communication technology. The white paper focuses on the state of Karnataka with specific reference to Bengaluru, making a series of recommendations for policy and legal reform to secure accessibility. It goes beyond the idea of reasonable accommodation by making a case for adopting universal design as an approach to urban planning towards creating truly inclusive cities. The key findings of this white paper are translatable and relevant to all states and municipalities across India. It outlines best practices based on a discussion of existing models, such as inclusive play spaces set up in Bengaluru by Kilikili and accessible urban transportation systems such as the Delhi Metro. The white paper is also aimed at filling a critical gap in the literature on accessibility to urban spaces by persons with disability from a legal perspective and is relevant to anyone invested in the project of building cities for all. Next slide, please. At the very outset, the white paper examines the international legal framework governing rights of persons with disabilities and their access to urban spaces. This includes a discussion on the UNCRPD, SDG 11, and the new urban agenda adopted in Habitat 3. At the national level, we have a progressive rights-based regime, which is reflected in the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016, which guarantees the right to an accessible, barrier-free environment to all persons with disabilities. This right is realized through the legal norms pertaining to urban planning and accessibility standards for built environment, transportation and mobility, and information and communication technology, which are issued primarily at the national level. Some of these include the URDPFI guidelines and the harmonized guidelines of 2016, which were revised recently, among others. However, the adoption, application, The ground level implementation and monitoring of these norms come within the purview of state agencies, development authorities, urban local bodies, and municipalities on account of their areas of operations and the function and mandate entrusted to them. For instance, the Karnataka Town and Country Planning Act lays down the manner in which master planning may be undertaken for all planning areas within the state of Karnataka. Similarly, building bylaws issued by municipalities across Karnataka laid out specifications for various categories of building, including accessibility standards for public buildings. Next slide, please. Upon review of the applicable legal framework, literature, and consultations with a wide range of stakeholders over the course of last year, some of our important findings were as follows. In India, accessibility standards and urban design primarily take into account physical and largely perceivable disabilities. There is no consideration of invisible disabilities. Persons with disabilities are typically not seen as users of urban spaces and therefore do not feature in the minds of planners. Cities are designed without taking them into account, and eventually this continues to keep persons with disabilities outside the scope of urban space users. Urban planning and accessibility standards often lack a cross-disability perspective. Accessibility standards, which are meant for a particular type of disability, has the potential for becoming a barrier for someone else, thereby highlighting the need for a universal design approach. Further, the existing urban planning paradigm does not enable participatory planning or facilitate representation of persons with disabilities, especially women. There are also serious implementation gaps within the legal framework. For instance, while there are accessibility standards for public buildings, these buildings continue to remain inaccessible. Similarly, even in the context of procurement, which forms a very integral part of implementation, there is a clear absence of any sort of disability perspective. In other words, accessibility initiatives remain sporadic with no last mile connectivity. Another key challenge is the lack of coordination between different government departments, which continue to operate in silos. There is also lack of sensitization, awareness, and technical capacity, both within the government as well as the private sector, particularly at the local level of implementation. Next slide, please. Some of our key recommendations are as follows. Systemic legal reforms towards encouraging inclusive and participatory planning and representation of persons with disabilities. To that end, the white paper suggests revisions to the legal framework at the Karnataka state level as well as municipal level for planning authorities across states to have representations from communities of persons with disabilities, especially women, incorporating participatory and inclusive planning processes and greater decentralization of the planning function itself by bringing it within the purview of municipalities with greater empowerment of ward committees. The white paper recommends periodic review of existing accessibility standards after consulting all relevant stakeholders to include accessibility standards for invisible and psychosocial disabilities, as well as integrate any new research on accessible urban spaces and technological innovations. Policy changes for building awareness and sensitization at different levels of the government and undertaking training and capacity building at an institutional level have also been recommended. Next slide, please. For ensuring better implementation of the existing legal framework, the white paper, for instance, recommends that in the context of built environment, the building bylaws across municipalities in Karnataka must be amended to clearly mandate certification and inspection by persons with disabilities in the capacity of an empaneled professional. Similarly, procurement laws in Karnataka may be amended to give preferences to agencies that employ persons with disabilities to get a particular perspective on a project, as well as include accessibility or criteria as well as criteria for universal design in all procurement processes at the state as well as municipal level. Ultimately, by way of a long-term recommendation, the white paper lays out pathways for the progressive realization of a universal design approach. Existing attempts at accessibility only focus on barrier-free design. Universal design, which is aimed at universal accessibility, is beneficial to everyone, not just for women and persons with disabilities, but the elderly, persons with strollers, pregnant women, people with chronic illnesses, and children, with the aim of removing barriers to access and creating an inclusive environment for everyone. The early incorporation of universal design, rooted in local contexts, following a participatory and consultative process, is key to making equitable cities. Disability is often still seen as an exceptional individual circumstance meant to be overcome. Instead, the white paper showcases that it is our cities that must be transformed and designed to be welcoming to everybody and every kind of body. This paper is a step towards making this a reality. Thank you so much.